All right, today we are reading chapter 15 in Torpedoed. And this question says, what music do you play for stones and toilet paper? Rock and roll. All right, the longest night. The Betches held on to each other in the raft. 5 people were on a raft that was made for 3. Derek and Sonia and their mother, Margaret, Doris Walker, a woman who had been on her way back home to Australia, and Tommy Milligan, the sailor who had helped them onto it. Milligan was 19, an engineer from the ship. He knew that Eric Davis, though he didn't know his name, had saved their lives. If Davis hadn't swum, pulling their raft further away from the ship, they all would have been sucked under when the Benares went down. They'd had 5 minutes to spare. 5 minutes. The raft rode up and down on the waves like a bucking bronco, the wind blowing, the hail pelting them. They had to hold on, but it was hard to keep a grip. It hurt. The raft was a flat, slatted piece of wood held together with nails and rope, like a diving raft in a lake. Between the slats were buoyancy cylinders, big, empty, rusty drums. The Betches hung on by putting their fingers into the slats, but the cylinders kept pinching them so painfully that they had to keep moving their hands to get some relief. And the waves kept coming, high white horses with their foam. They could hear them approaching as if they were actually galloping horses. One of the people on the raft would shout, "Hold on!" and they would try to hold on even tighter. It was like going down Niagara Falls, but over and over again. Already, Marguerite's fingers were red with blood. For much of the time, she lay on top of Derek so he wouldn't be swept into the sea by a wave. They could see no other rafts, no lifeboats. Now and then, bits of wreckage from the ship came their way, but they didn't see another soul. There was no one to help if the raft could not hold them. As the night wore on, the rough seas would steadily knock the nails out of the beach's raft. They didn't realize it, but it was already starting to break apart. Colin figured they were about 800 miles from the nearest shore. Actually, they were closer, more like 600 miles from the coast of Ireland. The ship was torpedoed almost 300 miles from the uninhabited Rockfall in the North Atlantic. In any case, they were too far from land. Colin knew his lifeboat was in trouble. It was filled with water, hardly floating, and the storm was raging. Gale force winds. His mother had assured him that if they were torpedoed by the Royal Navy, would rescue them. He had to survive, so that was his goal. He had to concentrate on staying alive and, if he could, helping others in his boat. People in his boat were dying. Some were swept out into the sea. Others were dying from the cold, Lascars mostly, because of their light clothing and children. Colin had never seen a dead body. Now he was surrounded by them. Exposure to severely cold air and water lowers a person's body temperature so much, everything inside slows down. The liver, kidneys, lungs. Muscles can't function well when they are too cold. So a low body temperature causes a heart muscle to slow down. When the heart slows down, it goes into an irregular rhythm. Then it stops. So the more clothes you have on and the warmer you are, the more likely you are to survive. If you are lucky enough to be in a lifeboat or a place in a lifeboat that's protected from the wind, you have a better chance of surviving. Colin was warmer than most in his coat and special life jacket. At some point, he put his hands in the pockets of the life jacket and discovered his mother had put gloves inside. They were string gloves, made not for warmth but for gripping onto things. They should help him hold on. He was a very lucky boy. But others were not so fortunate. As the night went on, more and more people on his boat died. The dead bodies bumped into the survivors. They had to put the dead overboard. Colin helped when he could, though he was busy taking care of the nurse. She was cold and terrified. Colin cradled her head in his arms and comforted her, while holding on to his seat so he wouldn't fall into the ocean as the lifeboat went up and down in the large waves. The adults looked at him in wonder. On the ship, walking around by himself, reading a book, talking to the adults, he had seemed so mature for an 11-year-old. Now, holding on to the nurse, helping the others with the dead bodies, he was more than just mature for his age. He was heroic. Colin had not wanted to leave home. The farm at Glam Usk near Abergavenny in Wales was heaven. It was so different from London. The farm had no electricity, so at night they had to light oil lamps. Colin and his brother Julian, who was 6 years younger, would walk through a meadow to the River Usk, which was wide and slow and had a beach they could play on. Colin was old enough to help the farmers with their crops. He rode horses and mucked out the farm, getting dirty, wearing rough clothes, and felt like a vacation. The farm, like one big playground. He loved being independent. He was even allowed to ride his bicycle a few miles into town. He would have been perfectly happy to ride out the war there, no matter how long it lasted, but his parents wanted him to go to America to be safe, because they loved him. So he had told himself to buck up. And now here he was, holding a dying woman in his arms, surrounded by bodies, being pelted with freezing rain and hail on a tumultuous ocean. Jack Keeley couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. The hail was coming down so hard it felt like people were throwing stones at him, and the cold was so cold. All he had on were thin pajamas and a life jacket. His feet were bare, his boots gone, but he didn't complain. He was always one for questions. Now he asked Eric Davis, "How high are the waves?" Eric thought they were over 20 feet. Eric and Jack devised a system of tying themselves in knots so they could stay on the raft as it went up and down the high waves, because that's what it did all night. Up with the wave, down as it passed. Up with the wave, down as it passed. Up and down, up and down. After a while, they found some food. There was a little cupboard in the middle on the raft with tins of milk and ship's biscuits. There's a picture. It was very hard to maneuver well enough to drink the milk, and it was pretty impossible to eat a ship's biscuits dry. Ship's biscuits, or hardtack, are made of only flour, water, and a little salt. They are hard and dry and don't taste like anything much, but if you can manage to get one down, it will fill you up. They succeeded in opening a tin of the condensed milk, but it was difficult to drink. So thinking how to hold the can in the raft too. But Eric told Jack to drink it, so he did. And he told him to eat the biscuits, and Jack did. The other man on the raft didn't speak at all. He had been injured, a gash in his head. It was John McGlasson, the second engineer, the man who thought that the Benares should have left the convoy and cut and run when the torpedo hit. He'd been asleep. He was awakened by a terrific thud. He knew immediately that the damage was serious, and jumping out of bed, put on his shoes, and proceeded to the engine room controls in his pajamas. The water in the engine room was already deep and rising quickly. In a matter of minutes, it was up to his waist. The chief engineer ordered him and the others in the engine room to save themselves. The ship was going down. McGlasson went to the muster station for Lifeboat 2, but that lifeboat with Colin Ryder Richardson on it had already been lowered. He turned his attention to Lifeboat 4. This was Barbara Betch's lifeboat. He helped many passengers get down into it, using a lifeline and a ladder. Then he went to help launch the rafts. Finally, with much difficulty, he got himself onto one. When the ship went down, he was so close that waves threw him off. Fortunately, he landed near another raft. That's how he ended up with Eric Davis. Sometime in all that, McGlasson had been injured. He and Eric Davis had heard Jack's cries and managed to haul him into the raft. Now the three of them drafted about in heavy seas. McGlasson was suffering from his injury as well as the cold. He was enough of a sailor to know that it was a race against time. Would exposure get to him, little Jack and Eric Davis, before rescue? He held out hope. Although the night was dark and stormy, every once in a while the storm abated. The clouds would part and the moon would shine. It was only one day past full, so when it was not behind a cloud, it cast light for the survivors to see a little bit. Bess Walters saw jeweled hands in the moonlight. Clinging to the keel of the overturned lifeboat was an elderly woman. She had exquisite rings on every finger. Bess looked around. Who else was holding on? Who belonged to the hand she saw? Beth Cummings, her new friend, was still there, holding on to the keel. If Beth, who had never swum in her life, had managed to swim in the cold, high ocean waves to the lifeboat, she could hold on too, right? The two new friends, gasping the keel on the opposite side of the overturned boat, nodded at each other. They were big, strong girls. They had some hope of surviving. Their body types would help. Being bigger with extra weight was an advantage. But it would take more than that. It would take determination, guts, and smarts. They both realized to talk would court danger. If they opened their mouths wide, they might swallow a mouthful of water and drown. So they spoke briefly. Beth said, "We'll hang on." Yes, Beth answered. They had made a pact. So there they are talking to each other. Margaret Betch knew that Derek was young enough and little enough that he could easily fall asleep and die from the cold. He was at greater risk too because he hadn't eaten all day, in spite of the nice man bringing him food. Children who had been eating well with food in their bellies had a better chance to survive the cold, though it certainly was not a guarantee. Those with little protective fat with little food in their systems were even more likely to die. Luckily for Derek, his mother was with him, and she was determined to keep him alive, lying on top of him, no matter how uncomfortable that was for either of them. When he drifted into sleep, she yelled at him, "Wake up, wake up!" He didn't know he'd fallen asleep, but her yells woke him. Just a few hours earlier, when they knew they wouldn't get onto the lifeboat with Barbara, Margaret Beach had seen a young woman huddled in a corner of the ship. Tucked under her was a small girl, her daughter. Margaret told the mother, "There are rafts at the other end of the ship. Come with us. We're going to get on a raft," but the woman couldn't budge. She was riveted with fright. Margaret held on to the raft, and Sonia held on to the raft. They assumed that if they could just hold on until daylight, they'd be rescued. Most of the children who made it into lifeboats were little. Many of them were not dressed warmly. All through the night, they drifted into sleep, then unconsciousness, and finally death. On Colin's lifeboat, fewer and fewer people remained alive. What if his mother had sent Julian with him? He was only 5. Would he have died? The ship's nurse got worse and worse as the hours passed, and then she died in Colin's arms. For a long time, he didn't realize she was dead. He kept holding her, comforting her. On Bess and Beth's keel, hands started to let go. Those hands with the beautiful rings, those jeweled fingers, were no longer holding on to the keel. In a matter of hours, how long had it been? Bess didn't know. Time was strange. She realized that only 3 other people were left. Beth and 2 Lascars, one of whom had tied himself to the gear at the back of the boat. He was still there, but dead, having drowned when the big wave washed over him. The other Lascar had managed to lash himself up too. He was still alive, but Bess thought he was delirious. He kept praying, saying God's name over and over again. Allah, Allah. It seemed all anyone could do was pray and hope, and hold on. There had been one great calamity after another, Bess thought, and then a huge wave came, and she was sure it was the end. It was the biggest wave she'd ever seen. Bess gritted her teeth. "Hang on," she yelled to Beth. As soon as she said it, they were both flung sky high. They held onto the keel. They couldn't let go, or that would be it. Their bodies would be slammed back into the overturned boat like 2 sacks of coals. Then it happened again and again and again. The waves kept flinging them up and down, their bodies lifted by the force of the water, and then banged down onto the hole over and over. At some point, Beth managed to entwine her hands in some rope, but Bess couldn't get to the rope, so she had to keep grasping the keel, holding on tight and not letting go. Her hands were thin, but her determination was strong. It had to be. She had to get back home to her parents. Her mother hadn't been worried about her. She had always been an adventurer, but Louis? Where was he? Was he alive? They couldn't lose both children. The Betches didn't know there was food on their raft. Sustenance would have helped keep their energy up, helped them stay awake. Having to hold on kept Sonia awake and alert, but as the night wore on, it became harder not to fall asleep, difficult not to. Sonia rolled off the raft into the water. Down, down she went, the jewelry box still in her pocket. She woke up under the water. It was calm, peaceful. Sonia knew she had drowned. There was white before her eyes, and she thought, "This must be heaven." She thought, "I wonder what God is going to be like." Bess knew it would have been so easy to let go, to fall asleep in the water. But she and Beth, across the boat, kept each other going. Bess knew she had to stay alive to explain to her parents what had happened to Louis. It was her doing that they had gone on the ship. She'd come home from school one day and told her mother, "I want to go to Canada." "How do you propose to do that?" her mother answered. "All you have to do is write a letter," Bess told her. "Oh, what nonsense," her mother said. They had gotten the core materials, and Bess and her father pored over them, and they applied. She and Louis waited every day to see whether a letter would come. One day, as Bess and Louis were sitting down to breakfast, their mother asked, "What would you say to me if I said you could go to Canada?" Bess and Louis jumped up and down like Jack in the Boxes. Her mother nearly dropped the teapot she was holding. They were jumping up and down so much. Louis, her father, had told her to look after that young man. She hadn't. She had been glad that she didn't have to run after him on the ship. But now she had to get home to explain to her parents why she hadn't been able to save her brother. "Grow up to be a good woman," her mother had said. She had to grow up. They were supposed to go live with an aunt. The aunt had sent ecstatic letters saying she looked after her and Louis. Now it was only her, and she had to survive. To get back home, to tell her parents, explain. Beth had to get home too. Her mother would be heartbroken if she died. The 2 girls across the boat didn't talk much. They couldn't, but if one hung on, so did the other.